I remember the morning clearly because the air in Malabo felt heavier than usual and the sea breeze that normally carried salt and comfort seemed distant, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I had arrived in Equatorial Guinea only a few weeks earlier, carrying ambition, fear, and a single official envelope that contained my working letter. That letter represented hope, a chance to build a future in a land that was not mine by birth but had begun to feel like a place where my destiny was. Quietly waiting, the National Financial Investigation Agency was located in a tall pale building not far from the administrative district. Its walls were wide and serious and its gates stood open yet intimidating. As I walked toward the entrance, my shoes echoed against the pavement and each step felt like a test of courage. I held the envelope tightly against my chest as if it could hear my thoughts and reassure me. Inside the building the air was cool and smelled faintly of paper, ink and polished floors. Officials moved back and forth carrying folders, speaking in low, disciplined voices. I approached the reception desk and announced my purpose. I explained that I had come to deposit my working letter for review and possible approval. The woman at the desk looked at me carefully, then nodded and asked me to wait. Minutes passed slowly, then more minutes. I sat on a long bench and watched the rhythm of the institution. I wondered how many lives had been changed within these walls, how many dreams had been approved or denied with a signature. Eventually a man in a dark suit approached me. He spoke politely and asked me to follow him. We walked through a hallway lined with framed documents and photographs of former leaders and national symbols. Finally we reached a large wooden door. Inside the office stood the leader of the agency. His name in this story is Boltier Ngoma. He was tall, composed and carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to decisions that shaped entire systems. His eyes were sharp but not unkind, and when he spoke his voice was calm and deliberate. He invited me to sit and asked me to explain why I wanted to work with the agency. I spoke honestly. I spoke of my education, my values and my desire to contribute to transparency and integrity. I handed him the envelope and he accepted it slowly, as if weighing more than paper. As he read parts of the letter, his expression changed from neutral to thoughtful. He asked questions about my background, my resilience and my understanding of responsibility. Our conversation went far beyond employment. We spoke about ethics, about the burden of leadership and about how life often redirects people when they least expect it. At some point he leaned back in his chair and looked at me in silence. Then he smiled faintly and said that the letter would be reviewed but that he wanted to continue the conversation later. He told me to meet him that evening somewhere in the city. He mentioned a quiet place overlooking the lights of Malabo where the ocean meets the streets. I left the building confused yet strangely calm. I did not know what awaited me, but something in his voice suggested that this meeting was important beyond professional matters. That evening I dressed simply and walked toward the location he had described. The city was alive. Cars moved like streams of light and music floated from open windows. The smell of grilled food and sea air filled the streets. When I arrived I saw him standing near a balcony overlooking the harbor. The lights reflected on the water like scattered stars. He greeted me not as an official but as a man. We spoke freely without titles or formal language. He told me about his life, the sacrifices leadership had demanded and the loneliness that often followed power. I listened and shared my own story, my uncertainties and my longing for belonging. Time passed unnoticed and the city around us softened into background noise. Then he spoke words that changed everything. He said that sometimes destiny does not wait for approval stamps or office procedures. He said that some connections are recognized by the heart before they are recognized by institutions. That night under the Malabo sky he asked me to become his wife, not as an order, not as a transaction, but as a declaration. He said that partnership was stronger than position and that he wanted a life built on trust rather than protocol. I was stunned. My mind raced with questions, fear and disbelief, yet I felt a deep sense of clarity, as if the path had been quietly forming long before that moment. I said yes. That night did not feel rushed or forced. It felt inevitable. Before my letter could be approved by any committee, my life had already been approved by something greater. In the days that followed, the city seemed different. The agency building no longer felt intimidating but familiar. The future no longer felt uncertain but open. Our union was quiet and private. No grand announcements, no ceremonies filled with spectacle, just two people choosing each other. In a world governed by systems that often forget the human heart, eventually my working letter was approved, but by then it felt secondary. I had found not just a job but a place, a purpose and a partner. Malabo became my home, not because of documents or titles but because love had anchored me there. And whenever I walk past the National Financial Investigation Agency, I remember that day, the envelope, the office, the unexpected invitation, and I smile knowing that some journeys begin as applications but end as lives transformed. After that night in Malabo, nothing in my life followed the shape it once had. The days began to fold into a new rhythm, one that no longer revolved around officers, documents, or approvals. Instead, my time revolved around him and the quiet gravity that pulled me into a hidden life. By morning, I was no longer a visitor waiting for permission to belong. I woke each day knowing that my place was already decided, not by policy but by choice. We kept everything discreet in public. I remained an ordinary woman. Blending into the city streets in private, I became his daily presence and his night refuge. There were no announcements, no declarations, no visible change in his powerful public image. He continued to lead with discipline and precision. I continued to move softly through the city, but beneath the surface a separate world existed, one built on whispered messages, careful meetings, and shared silence. He arranged a residence for me not far from the coast. It was modest from the outside but warm and filled with light. From the balcony I could see the ocean breathing in slow waves. That place became my anchor. Every morning he would send a message, not with words of authority but with tenderness. Sometimes it was a simple question asking if I had slept well. Sometimes it was a reminder to eat. Sometimes it was nothing more than reassurance that I was not forgotten. During the day I explored Malabo. I learned the markets, the faces, the sounds. Vendors began to recognize me. The city slowly claimed me as one of its own. At night our world opened. He would arrive quietly, without escorts, without ceremony. The man who carried the weight of institutions would step through the door and set that weight down. In those hours I was not an accessory to power. I was his companion, his rest, his chosen shelter. I did not ask about the progress of my working letter. At first I told myself I was simply being patient. Later I realized the truth. I no longer cared. The urgency I once felt to secure employment faded like an old ambition that no longer fit, not because I became lazy or dependent but because my understanding of value had shifted. He provided everything: security, stability, comfort, but more than material things he offered presence. In a world where his time was the most expensive currency, he spent it with me. Became his daily wife in the quiet sense, the one who listened when the day had been heavy, the one who reminded him of ordinary life beyond reports and investigations. I prepared meals, we ate together without rushing, we spoke about nothing and everything. At night I became his night wife, not in a graphic sense but in intimacy of trust. We shared space, warmth, vulnerability. He slept better when I was there. I learned that power does not erase human fragility, it only hides it from the public eye. Everything had to remain secret. The city was full of eyes. Rumors travel faster than truth. We protected what we had with silence. Sometimes it was difficult. There were moments when I wanted to walk beside him openly, moments when I wanted to exist without hiding, but I understood the cost. His position required distance from personal exposure. I accepted that our love lived in the margins, not weaker for it, perhaps stronger. As weeks turned into months, the agency became a distant concept. The building I once feared now existed only as a backdrop to our story. My letter remained somewhere in a file, whether approved or forgotten. I no longer knew. People sometimes asked me what I did for work. I smiled and gave vague answers. I said I was settling. Aini said I was learning the city. The truth was harder to explain. I was living a life funded not by a salary but by a man who had chosen me as his partner. He became my provision, not because he demanded dependence but because he wanted to remove worry from my days. He encouraged me to read, to write, to learn. He never asked me to be idle. He wanted my mind alive, my spirit growing. I began to write journals, capturing thoughts, emotions, and observations. Those pages became my private career, my record of transformation. There were nights when he spoke of pressure, of enemies disguised as colleagues, of the burden of always being watched. In those moments I realized why secrecy was necessary. I also realized why he needed me. I was not a threat, I was not an ambition, I was peace. There were times when he traveled. Those nights felt longer, but even then his presence remained through calls, messages, and promises of return. When he came back, the reunion was always quiet but intense. No grand gestures, just relief. I learned the art of patience, the art of waiting without resentment, the art of loving without possession. The city of Malabo continued to grow around us. New buildings rose, old streets remained. Life moved forward inside our hidden world. Time felt suspended. Sometimes I wondered who I would have become if I had followed the path of employment, if I had worn office clothes and chased promotions. That version of me felt distant, not wrong but no longer mine. I was not trapped, I was chosen, and I chose him every day. As his wife in secret I carried responsibility. I guarded his trust, I guarded our story, I guarded myself. Our love was not loud, it did not demand recognition, it simply existed, and in that existence I found a fulfillment deeper than any title or paycheck. The job I once sought became irrelevant because the life I was living required my full presence, my emotional intelligence, my discretion, my strength. In a way I was still working, but my role was invisible. As Malabo lights flickered each night I understood something clearly: not all salaries are Paid through institutions, some are paid through loyalty, care and shared destiny, and in that quiet understanding I rested. The questions did not come all at once, they came slowly like a tide that rises without warning. At first it was a casual comment from a friend, then a careful observation from a relative. Eventually it became a direct question from my parents. They had been watching my life from a distance. They saw the changes before they heard the explanations. They noticed my clothes, my calm, my confidence. They noticed that I no longer spoke about job applications or interviews. They noticed that I never complained about rent or food. When my mother visited Malabo, she looked around my home quietly. She touched the furniture. She stood on the balcony and watched the ocean. She did not accuse. She did not judge. She simply asked, "Where does all this come from? You do not work, yet you live well." Her voice carried concern, not suspicion. Concern born from love and fear of the unknown. I felt my chest tighten. I had rehearsed answers in my mind, but none felt complete. "How do you explain a life built on secrecy without betraying?" I told her that I was being supported, that I had found stability in unexpected ways, that I was safe. She asked who. I smiled gently and said, "Someone who cares deeply for me." That answer did not satisfy her. It could not. Parents are trained by instinct to look beyond words. Later my father asked me directly. He was less gentle, he was practical. He wanted clarity. He asked if I was dependent, if I was being controlled, if I had lost my independence. Those questions hurt, not because they were cruel, but because they were rooted in fear. I told him the truth without revealing the details. I told him that I had chosen this life, that no one had forced me, that I was respected and valued. I told him that I had never felt more secure. My friends were less restrained. They joked, they whispered, they speculated. Some assumed I had inherited money. Some believed I had found a foreign benefactor. Some admired the mystery. Others resented it. I learned quickly who wished me well and who merely watched. Living a quality life without visible income turns you into a mirror. People project their assumptions onto you, their envy, their curiosity, their doubt. I stopped trying to convince anyone. I realized that explanation invites judgment, silence protects peace. When pressure became heavy, I spoke to him. I told him about my parents' worries, about my friends' questions, about the weight of living unseen. He listened without interrupting. Then he held my hands and said something I will never forget. He said that when you live outside the rules, people understand. They feel threatened by what they cannot categorize. He reminded me that secrecy was not shame, it was strategy. He assured me that time would answer questions better than words. Still, he understood my discomfort. He did not dismiss it, he respected it. That was the day he made a promise. We were sitting quietly in the evening. The city lights were beginning to glow. The sound of traffic hummed in the distance. He told me that he wanted to give me something permanent, something that would not feel borrowed, something that would ground me. He promised me a new home, not a hidden residence, but a place that belonged to me, a place with my name on it, a place I could shape. He spoke of land, of walls that would hold my memories, of rooms filled with my laughter. I did not ask when, I did not ask where. The promise itself carried weight. Then he surprised me again. He spoke of a vacation, not a brief escape, but a journey meant to breathe. He said Zambia. He described wide skies, flowing rivers, places where time moves differently. He said we would go together, not as titles, not as shadows, but as two people resting. That promise did something to me. It was not about luxury, it was about acknowledgement. It told me that he saw me not as a secret burden, but as a partner deserving of joy. The days that followed felt lighter, even as questions continued around. Mimi, mother called again, her voice softer. This time she said she could hear peace in Mimi. Father stopped pressing. He said only that he trusted my judgment. Friends adjusted, some drifted away, some stayed. The real ones learned to accept mystery. Inside me something settled. I stopped feeling the need to justify my life. I stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. I focused on being present. Then one afternoon he arrived earlier than usual. His expression carried excitement restrained by habit. He told me that the plans were moving, that the house search had begun, that Zambia was no longer an idea. I felt something rise in my chest, not excitement alone, but validation. This life was not temporary, it was being built. I imagined walking through my own doorway, arranging furniture, planting flowers, hosting my parents. I imagined waking up in Zambia, hearing unfamiliar birds, watching water move endlessly. I imagined freedom without explanation. That night as we sat together, I realized something clearly. The questions from others had been necessary. They forced me to examine my truth, and my truth was solid. I was not surviving, I was living. I was not dependent, I was partnered. I was not hiding from work, I was engaged in a different Form of labor, emotional labor, discretion, support. The world recognizes only visible effort, but there are unseen roles that sustain power itself. I had become part of that unseen world as the weeks continued. Preparations unfolded quietly, documents, arrangements, plans that did not announce themselves. My parents began planning another visit, this time with curiosity rather than worry. My friends noticed my steadiness. The questions softened and I moved forward with grace. I understood that not everyone would understand, and that was acceptable because the life I was living did not require approval, it required alignment, and I had found it. Time does not disappear suddenly, it thins, it frays at the edges, it begins to slip through. Moments that once felt secure, at first I did not notice it, or maybe I noticed but refused to name it. His messages became shorter, his visits less predictable. Even when he was present, his mind often remained elsewhere. The man who once arrived quietly but fully began arriving distracted, carrying unfinished conversations on his shoulders, carrying tension he did not put down anymore. I told myself it was work. Leadership always demands more before it takes everything. I reminded myself that secrecy comes with sacrifice. Still, the nights grew longer and the silence between us began to speak. Sometimes days passed without seeing him. When he did come, his eyes searched the room as if listening for danger. He no longer stayed until morning. He no longer lingered in conversation. The intimacy that once felt effortless now required intention, and intention was what he no longer had time for. I did not accuse, I did not demand. I had learned too well that asking for more could cost everything, but something inside me shifted. A quiet fear began to live alongside love. At the same time, another awareness grew elsewhere, in a different house, behind a different set of walls. His public wife, the woman who shared his name officially, the woman who stood beside him at events and ceremonies. She had lived for years with the understanding that power demands distance, that marriage to a leader means sharing him with responsibility, with the nation with expectations. But even disciplined woman noticed patterns. She noticed how his schedule changed, how he guarded his phone more closely, how his absences were no longer explained by meetings. She noticed the quiet tension he carried home, the way his thoughts drifted during conversations, the way his body remained alert even in rest. At first she told herself it was pressure, then she told herself it was age, then finally she allowed herself to ask a question she had avoided: who was taking the time he no longer had? She did not confront, she observed. She noticed unfamiliar pauses in his routine. She noticed locations mentioned casually that did not align with official duties. She noticed a name that appeared in conversations with staff more than once, not mine, never mine, but a shadow of presence that did not belong to work. The city is small when power is involved. People speak quietly, but they speak. A driver hesitated once before answering a question. A secretary adjusted a calendar entry too carefully. A guard avoided eye contact. Pieces do not shout, they accumulate. Meanwhile, I felt the change from the other side. I sensed the weight pressing against our secrecy, the careful balance beginning to tilt. One night he arrived later than usual, his face tired in a way that did not come from work alone. He sat down without touching me, without removing his jacket, without settling. I asked softly if everything was all right. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was distant. He said things were becoming complicated. That word settled heavily between us. He did not explain further. He did not need to. I understood secrecy works only while it remains invisible. Once noticed, it demands payment. From that night onward, our time became rationed, schedule compressed into moments rather than evenings. I became something he visited rather than lived with. I did not blame him, I blamed the structure that made love something dangerous. At the same time, his wife grew quieter, more watchful. She stopped asking direct questions and began asking strategic ones. She observed his reactions, not his words. When she mentioned certain places, his posture changed. When she spoke of trust, his silence deepened. She was not a woman without intelligence. She had survived power long enough to read absence. One afternoon she made a decision. She did not seek confrontation, she sought confirmation. She began following patterns, not physically but socially. She asked questions under the cover of concern. She listened more. Then she spoke. She allowed others to reveal themselves through small inconsistencies, and slowly a shape emerged, not a face, not a name, but a truth. There was another life her husband moved through, carefully, quietly, but emotionally invested. That realization did not arrive with anger, it arrived with grief. Grief for time lost, for honesty withheld, for a marriage transformed into performance. When she finally confronted him, it was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no accusations. She simply Said you are no longer fully here. Silence answered her. That silence was confirmation from that moment. Everything accelerated. Pressure increased at home, at work. Within him, the man who once felt untouchable began to feel surrounded. Every decision carried risk, every absence carried meaning, and I felt it too. Our conversations grew cautious. He no longer spoke freely, he weighed every word. I realized then that I had become something dangerous to him, not because of what we were but because of what we represented. Choice, love outside structure is threatening to power built on image. I asked him once if we were reaching an end, not an accusation, a question. He looked at me for a long time before answering. He said, I do not want to lose you, but I cannot afford to be seen. That was the moment I understood the cost clearly. I had been his refuge, but now refuge itself was a risk, and his wife, the woman who carried his public life, was no longer blind. She did not hate me, she did not even know me, but she knew enough, and knowledge changes everything.